Okay, well, should we get started? I'll take up the next the first couple minutes anyway. So anybody who comes is yet to come will not miss any of Darren's presentation just yet. But I'll kick us off. So I want to welcome you all, and it's great to see a good turnout here like this. You don't even all fit on my screen, so I'm gonna have to scroll over to see who else is on the next one. So much appreciate you all coming and being here for Darren's talk. So I'm Peter Friederici, and I'm director of the Sustainable Communities Program at NAU, and I have had the honor these last, what has it been, a couple of years now, of being the chair of Darren's Thesis Committee, and I'm really happy to see this work coming to a culmination. And I can say Darren is one of the students I've worked most closely with in recent years, and that's been a treat. I want to welcome the other committee members and thank them for their work. So Rosemary Logan, who is a food systems expert, I can say, here in Flagstaff, Arizona. And then also Richard Rushforth. So Richard, if you could give us a quick wave there, who is a research professor in the College of Informatics here at NAU. And that is one of the interesting and, to me, wonderful things about Darren's thesis and Darren's work more broadly is that he's been able to bring together these what usually are considered very disparate sets of data or even ways of looking at the world, namely a very quantitative means of doing so, as well as quite qualitative language related ways of seeing the world. And that's one of the, to me, what really attracted me to his thesis in the first place. So so thanks very much to Rosemary and Richard also for their contributions to this work. The way that the format will work here, so for our thesis presentations, Darren will present first, and I know he has some slides to show you in the aid of the presentation, and that'll be half hour-ish, something like that. And then we'll open the floor up to questions from anybody and everybody for about another half an hour or so. And that can be anything. And then after that, once we get to a certain point, I'll close off that questioning, and then Darren and the three committee members will go into our own room, into a small room, virtually speaking, and we will have some specific questions for Darren, probably about his thesis. We'll see if there's issues we have, and then we come out from that. And so we can either, depending on whether folks want to stick around, we can go into a Zoom breakout room for that discussion, and then we can come back out and announce the results of that deliberation. Or if nobody's going to stick around for that part, I'm sure Darren will be very happy to make an announcement later about what the outcome of that has been. So so that's the general structure, and wow, it looks like we're up to 36 participants. So we have got a big room full of people here, which is great. So so with that, again, thanks everybody for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Darren for your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter, very much. I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can kind of see what I'm going to be talking about. As a person of,
let me just say one other thing, just in the interest of public disclosure, which is that we are recording the presentation. So just so that everybody knows that for posterity. Okay, sorry, Darren.
Yeah,
okay,
actually, yeah, thank you for saying that. So I've asked some friends and family to take screenshots. So if you don't want yourself seen, you can actually let me know, and I can have your name blocked out or a smiley face, just so you know. Also, keep yourself muted for me, and also, as much as I'd like to see your faces, maybe have your pictures off just for bandwidth. We have some people in rural areas that might be calling in. Maybe I can give you all a call if you want to see my face again. Thank you again for everyone for joining. An hour ago, my main laptop actually crashed, so this is my backup. So everything's good and functioning, but as a person of preparedness, always be ready to back up everything. So my topic is decomposing the semantics of local food. an analysis of USDA food flows in organizations of Arizona. So decomposing means to break down organic matter. The word semantics is a linguistic branch meaning the meaning of words or language. And so my goal was to decompose the language and the meaning of local food for Arizona using US government agricultural data, as well as local food organizations in Arizona. I would like to specifically thank all of my committee members for all of your time and effort, all of your energy, all of your support over the last couple of years. Each of you have created a critical role over the last couple of years for me. And though you might not think it, it has been inspiring to work with you and true mentors. I'd also like to thank Richard Rushforth, Bo Stevens, Anderson Moyer, and Ben Ruddell for their collaboration on this thesis. Additionally, I'd like to thank my program and all of the professors that I've had. I also have a certificate in city planning from the graduate college here at NAU, as well as working on my sustainable communities here. I'd also like to thank my family members and specifically my mother for just kind of being awesome, but also being an editing queen for me, really helping me work on my verbiage and making it so that others can understand. So, and personal introduction, my motivation and my story. My family would pile into a red van and travel across the country. And oftentimes it would lead to this small family farm in southeastern Idaho, pictured here. My grandfather was a hard worker. He was an organic wheat farmer. And through experiences watching him in the summers, as well as just talking to him over the years, I learned the opportunities and challenges that small organic farmers really have in getting to their consumers and being able to tell their story. Once this kind of became a big life thing, I decided to go to school at Utah State and wanted to do nutrition. I was fascinated with the human body and how we could eat healthy and connect to kind of place and earth. And through that experience, I worked at the Student Organic Farm, where we were less than a mile away from the university, and we had a straight to consumer program where we really could connect to the food. With that experience and the goal of going into food as a kind of a thing that I liked because everyone eats. I worked here at a school on the right with students to grow their own food. We actually developed one of the first garden to school programs with Rosemary's help. For over 2 years, I was able to kind of see the importance of people growing their own food or knowing where food comes from. No matter the impact of growing food, if you know where it comes from, you're less likely to probably throw it away, and you're more likely to care about your immediate area. With that experience, I worked with this local farmers market here in Flagstaff. Art Babbitt gave me the opportunity to work on the waste areas because I specialize a lot in waste system architecture and engineering. But I found that consumers would come to me and talk to me about local food and what it meant and what it was. I worked with direct producers and people at the market. With this experience, I started to talk to some of the informatics professors, Ben Ruddell and Richard Rushforth, and got a job working with the Complex Systems Informatics Lab, looking at what and where is local. I am a person of semantics. I really care about what we mean. We need to define, because I'll argue, as a lot of you know, but I want to know what the meaning is in the definition so that we can actually have a place of understanding and a place to go from. And so the purpose of this project was to address some of the horror stories that we all hear about local food. You know, you walk down the grocery store and it says local and you're holding a Florida orange and you're in Missouri. And, you know, a lot of people would kind of be confused. But once again, if you think local is the United States, or if you think the planet Earth is the United States, it's all relative. And so my project was coming to terms with, I needed to put a boundary. So I wanted to look at Arizona. I did a national USDA food flow analysis with Richard and Ben and Bo, but I also wanted to use Arizona as a boundary to kind of contextualize what it meant to be local in Arizona in a place so that I could provide a shared meaning, a shared knowledge, and a shared framework that we could potentially have a conversation about, argue about, and discuss. My goals primarily are to provide transparent and accurate definitions for local. I hope to inspire a universal and flexible meaning in the state of Arizona, as well as I want to clarify what is not accurately attributed as local food. I also provide recommendations in how we can develop local food, as well as provide some frameworks for us to move forward. My key research questions are: what are the common ways of defining local food, and how do Arizona-based local food influencers define local food? When I say local food influencers, I exclude primarily restaurants and farmers. I'm looking primarily in that intermediary space of educational platforms like universities or schools, grocery stores, farmers markets, nonprofits, businesses, CSAs, co-ops, government agencies, so that in between the producer and the consumer gap. I wanted to know what they meant. Next, the big question was, in the state of Arizona, how do the quantifiable definitions, which are measurable, like political boundary, the diversity of the supply chain, the ruralness, which is based on population, or the food miles, compare to the qualitative content analysis that I looked at these local food influencers? So how does the reality match up with kind of the narrative that others are talking? And then the last and biggest question for me was, are there novel or new ways for defining or measuring local food in the state of Arizona? So when it comes to a literature review, we have to know what is food and where it comes from. We have to know the supply chain, because food does not just come from a farm for most of us in America. It's roughly 90% of us go to a grocery store. Very few of us actually have that direct farm to table actual life. And that's the issue, is we need to develop that farm to table experience, and we have to see what the standard is. And so you can see on the diagram here, from farm to table, we have all these supply chain steps, and there's usually transportation in between. And it depends on the type of food and where you live as to this network. Really big issue with our current food system is the consolidation. This, for example, is based on farms with products. Over the last 40 years, the consolidation is at historic levels. You can see almost a 60% reduction across most major food producers. And this can be very difficult, as we know, with COVID recently, with meat packing, because of the choke points of having 4 or 5 major businesses or major factories. It's very difficult when something happens to interrupt. Additionally, when you have potentially in Yuma, where it's the salad bowl of America, when you have a very large E. coli outbreak, this goes across the country, and it's a lot harder to control. Where if it was a local food network, you could specifically talk to every single person that actually had this. And so this consolidation is also across the supply chain. So from seed to table, there has been this consolidation. Next, we want to look at the consolidation in food products. So PepsiCo, for example, creates oatmeal, soda, Gatorade, orange juice, pasta, cookies. The list goes on. And this is all just one company. And so this consolidation continues across the supply chain. The last consolidation I want to talk about, and there's several other more, is the grocery store, the retail market, where 8 firms get about 50% of the retail sale, which is kind of a scary thought. If you think about competition in the marketplace, it's good to kind of have competition. It's also good to know that, once again, with a COVID thing, we need to have stronger, more diversified and maybe distributed networks. These major grocery stores, they are like your Safeways and your Walmarts. Think of those major Kroger stores. When it comes to the local food ideas, this is a friend of mine. He's doing a documentary on local food deserts around the country. And so he's heavily been working with me on kind of addressing both the rural food desert and the urban food desert. We typically look at food through this table. We're eating at the table, but it comes from a place. So is it from the field? Is it from a farmer with a head of lettuce? Is it from a market where you're going through? Or is it from a preserved product? And so when you look at local food, the common meanings, and this is just a list of a couple major ones, you see the range. It goes from a political boundary of state to 400 miles. In Canada, it's 31 miles, interestingly enough. If you want to consider locavore, which was a movement that actually really pushed the local food onto the scene 20 years ago, 100 miles was the big one. Now, I want to point you all to the National Consumer Survey here, because consumers are actually a big driver of these common meanings. It's the consumers that actually have the biggest range in perceptions and attributes. And so realistically, we have to look at who are we talking to and who actually is defining these. The big one I want to point to next is values under this Erickson's 3 domains. This is a theoretical framework that I'm going to be using, but he talks about this value attribute that is very broad and very difficult to quantify, but it is able to be qualified. And that's where my thesis, that's the true beauty, is I'm trying to bring these quantifiable political boundaries and distance together with these values that are kind of abstract sometimes, or are more defined in talk and in meaning. We want to look at the importance of local food. Oftentimes it's seen as the antithesis to the big industrial supply chain, the contamination of the rivers with nitrogen overflow. We talk about, the big ag. Local food is seen typically as the counter to that. And you can see here since 1994, when it was started to be reviewed, farmers markets have gone up drastically. You can kind of see it's plateaued a little bit, but local food was a thing before big grocery stores came in. So typically, 200 years ago, you usually grew your own food, or you knew where it came from. And the few things that came from far away were specific items. Additionally, homeland security and American sovereignty and food security have been brought in to this local food narrative. And a lot of countries, a lot of states and a lot of counties, like this one, I think this is in Washington State, almost every one of these farm bureaus really pushed this, as well as if you look at World War II times, there was these victory gardens, which was really pushed as a way of helping the troops. When it comes to my theoretical framework, specifically when it comes to my quantitative stuff, we want to look at food resiliency, diversity, and things that we can quantify, things that we can measure. When it comes to my qualitative stuff, which is where I'm going to really heavily lean on this theoretical framework, we look at these domains of proximity that Erickson has talked about. We have these geographical, we have these relational, and we have these values. And it's kind of interesting because we're doing a taxonomy. We're essentially trying to break down, like it is a biological creature, a word, which is something I find fascinating. The next thing we really want to look at when it comes to why I chose to look at food influencers is the fact that when people change and when people create a behavior and a norm and an attitude, it is these local food influencers that create a critical role, and they play a part in creating this narrative and building a structure by which people think and by which they enact a meaning and a cause. And local food is essentially that. When you talk about it, what you think about it helps you build a decision about it, and then you go on to make a behavior. Specifically to local food, the economic value of it has actually been seen as an experience. So a lot of geographers have talked about how we are no longer in a commodity world or a goods world, because we've kind of advanced in the United States into this experience. So you're paying for something. And you often hear a lot of people say, hey, I'm in it for the experience, not in the money. And so when we look at local food, and specifically farmers markets, we've seen how this experience economy has actually flourished, because when you go to a farmer's market, you become a part of an experience. And this geographer Pine has actually talked about the 4 realms of an experience, and how a farmer's market can actually play a part into a passive participation of buying local food, or an active participation is the event immersive. And so when we look at local food, we can actually look at it as an experience that people are actually buying. The big methods, the 2 big methods is quantitative, which I'm going to discuss here. We looked at USDA food commodity data in 2012. So this is just a snippet. And so I want to say that this data is awesome, but it does have its shortcomings, as everything does. And that's where further investigation and better data tracking is really important. Richard Rushforth and Bo Stevens are the ones that really I leaned heavily on this methodology and the data coding, but we looked at millions of data points, and we looked at these 2 large data points, data sets from government data, and we essentially tracked food from farm to table, and we differentiated food based on how it was actually consumed at the end. Was it consumed by a cow or a car when it comes to soy or corn? Or was it consumed by a human, like lettuce and vegetables? Or was it consumed by us, but it went through a factory, like say your tortillas and your salsa? And so we tracked food data across the industrial classification system, and we looked at a distance metric from point to point to essentially see where food went and how far it went, to so we could paint what is local and actually how local is American food. The novelty is that we broke food up into these 3 major groups: the farm to table, which is your vegetables and your crops; We have then this farm to factory or this farm to feedlot, which are the things we actually don't eat, but you see maybe in Iowa or in Idaho or in Kansas, those big commodity crops. And then the third one, which is actually a very interesting and very novel way to look at food, is this manufactured, this value added, where there needs to be a factory or a processing or a packaging plant to get to your house, to get to you to eat. And so food comes to us through a network, and it depends on what type of food it is. The big next thing that we looked at for the novelty was the physical distance versus the resiliency. When I say resiliency, I mean the number of food producers in a given area. So think of one food producer versus 10. 10 is very good, one is very bad. So our resiliency was on a 0 to 1 ratio. And so as you looked at distance, we wanted to see how resilient was your food supply chain. The next thing is we looked at price over distance. We wanted to see actually what is the elasticity of price based on the product, and how can we kind of find that nice balance of how close is your food and how much do you pay for it. And then the last thing that I find really interesting that actually connects to a very large subgroup of data sets and individuals that are really interested in stuff. There's this urban to rural divide, which is based on the population. And this was from a national health classification of counties. And there was 6 classifications based on the population. And so we actually looked at how food moved across these different platforms, not platforms, but these different urban bins, these different urban bins, and based on rural to urbanness. These are the key findings. So the first column is table crops, so the stuff that you eat. The middle bulk one is going to be the stuff that goes to a cow or a car or an industrial process, like an oil or something. And then the manufactured is the stuff that comes to us to eat at the table, but it has a added step or two. And as you see, the top row is state, which does quite well. Blue is good, white is bad. So as you see, density, a lot of states do really well with growing bulk commodity crops. They do not do as well maybe in manufacturing. And some table crops in the first column do really well. So states like California, Florida, Washington, New York, things that you kind of would associate with having a lot of table crops, you can see that. But as you go down, we have a FAB zone, which is a federal designation for a metropolitan area. Unfortunately, this is once again based on population. And so there's only so many. So for example, here in Arizona, we have 3 FAB zones. We have a Phoenix area, a Tucson area, and a rural area. These FAB zones are a connection of counties. So it is essentially what counties are reliant on each other and how do they connect. And so on the very bottom row, you see how almost the whole country is in white. Very few counties have a lot of blue. And once again, as you look at the different type of food, some counties do really well. So if you look at the manufactured food, randomly, there's a lot of blue counties. But if you kind of look across the other way, it kind of gets different. So there is this nuance in scale. So as you get bigger in scale, it's easier to get local, which makes sense because local is a geographical term already. When it comes to the counties themselves, you can see Cochise stands out alone as doing really well. That is an anomaly. It's something that I would like to kind of further investigate. I know that there's going to be some things that we can actually kind of talk about when it comes to, for example, Santa Cruz County. That's right next to Mexico. A lot of our food actually goes through Nogales in the United States. So Santa Cruz actually has a very high percentage of manufacturing and table crops compared to what they normally would because they have 50,000 people. So because of where you are as a county, it really dictates what you do. So once again, look at Maricopa, our most populated county. They stand up and above everyone when it comes to manufactured food. And then once again, you see Coconino County. We have a really good supply of manufacturing, but then we really have almost nothing when it comes to our bulk or table crops, which once you learn about a place, you kind of can understand what they can do when it comes to growing their own food. Also, we broke food based on price and tonnage because some food, for example, an avocado is worth like $2 in some parts of the country, but a pound of oatmeal is worth 10 cents. So we wanted to show the difference in the price elasticity because certain foods have that differentiation. When it comes to distance and food, we looked at the different types of food. As you can look at the R value, we see that bulk food actually has the highest R value, which means that it correlates, price correlates to distance. So Bulk commodity crops are cheap usually, so they actually can't go far distances because they're cheap. And that's just kind of based on our current society and capitalism and economics. Why would you send something 200 miles if you could go 10 miles if it's cheaper? But if you look to your right, or my right, manufactured foods is actually has a really big intensity, so it actually can go really far. Whereas table crops, once again, it kind of sits in between the really expensive, salsa tomato and the really cheap corn. This is total distance. So this is for like every American. So you and I, most of our food at 10 miles is at less than 5%. When you get to 3,000 miles, 100% of our food is local at 3,000 miles. So that kind of makes sense because our country, looking at our size, we kind of have to have that as a boundary. But then you can look at the discrepancy at distance. When you look at the B column, you can see how manufactured food is actually not that local at farther distances. If you look at 1,000 miles, everything else, table crops and your bulk crops are at 100% local, but manufactured is still sitting below 90%. Once again, when it comes to the resiliency, so the number of farms or producers in a given area, this is really important because when we have shocks, when we have drought, when we have issues, it's better to have more. It's good to have redundancy, as well as having networks that can actually connect across regions is really important. So we have this balance we have to strike. And as you see, once again, when you get to the county level at the bottom, it's not doing as well. But some counties really do well. And so you can see that as you refine, you can see how the nuances are shown. So heavily producing counties might actually carry the whole state. So for example, Delaware, they do not well. They do not well. Sorry, that's not right English. They do not source food very well, but because they have a really good producing county, they're actually able to be above everyone else. When it comes to the resiliency and distance, which is an important thing because we want a resilient food supply chain, but we also don't want it coming from really far because distance is kind of a proxy for environmental impact because of the transportation. We see that we have a 200-mile kind of drop off and a range between 0.4 and 0.8 for resiliency. As you get to full resiliency and no resiliency, the distance really gets different. Now, I do want to say that when it comes to local food, we need to acknowledge that about 83% of our emissions are actually in the production of the food and not in the transportation. So distance is not the best indicator for a sustainable metric. Additionally, when you look at, for example, a vegetarian or vegan diet, their environmental impact is going to be a lot less, even if you eat everything within 10 miles. Because when you look at an animal product, the impact of an animal product is far heavier than that of a vegetable. And so just because you eat within a certain distance does not mean necessarily that you are more sustainable or more environmental. It is a good proxy sometimes, but we have to understand the difference. When it comes to Arizona itself and its resiliency, you see that the manufacturing is best across all platforms. And that's kind of something we need to look at because urban areas are known to have factories because of population, but our rural areas, which I would suggest that we have probably some pretty high producing counties in the rural areas for those different types of foods. When it comes to the classification on an urbanness, we see that we are most resilient, as a state, we're most resilient in our most urban area, which would be Maricopa or Phoenix area, and our most non-core, which is our most rural areas, which would be the La Paz, Apache, and Greenlee, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about because these individuals probably don't have a ton of grocery stores or food or producers, but they're still sourcing, or they have a very large percentage of their food being resilient. We also see that it drops off in resiliency in this middle area, which is something kind of fascinating to look at because we typically associate urban areas as not having the space to grow food. Now, the beautiful color circles, this is a national food flow. We look at non-core, which is your green or your very light green, and then we see purple, which is your medium counties. And so you see how in A, which is table crops, in B, bulk crops, as well as in C, there are different, and C is manufactured. You can see how different urban counties actually are heavily influencing. Specifically, you can see how in A, urban areas don't typically source table crops, and they don't typically source bulk crops. And once again, that's because urban areas in development, they don't have the area. And so you can kind of see how the food supply chain in America is dependent based on the food stuff, but also the urbanness. So we have these middle counties like Flagstaff, where we live here in Coconino County. It's an intermediary, or these middle grounds that really transport food from the rural producing states and rural producing counties to the urban counties that maybe do the manufacturing and the factories. Oh, additionally, you can see the state of Arizona broken down. Blue is the most urban, and purple is the most rural, and then red kind of sits in the middle there. When it comes to the national landscape, very few counties actually produce table crops as their primary product. It's interesting to see that I think Florida and Texas have some of the highest numbers, and then some of our other producing areas on the West Coast. But when it comes to Arizona, we see that we really have a breakdown between a commodity crop county and a manufacturing crop. Now, there are some differences, but a lot of the manufacturing counties are actually some of our more populated ones. We do have some outliers where Mojave County is a very populated area, but doesn't have a lot of manufacturing. But then we have somewhere like Santa Cruz, which has 50,000 people and has a very high percentage of manufacturing. But when I told you earlier, most of our food in America comes through Nogales for part of the year, and Santa Cruz is actually there. That is where all the food is. So that does make sense once again when you look at the context. When it comes to my qualitative chapter and my method, I looked at a content analysis. I wanted to look at keywords. I wanted to find theories, and I wanted to observe kind of what these influencers talked about and how do they describe it. This hasn't been done before. I was looking for other people that were doing this at a national level, and no one's really done this. So I kind of am doing this as I see fit. So love to discuss with people about better ways to do this and better ways of kind of categorizing. But I looked at 153 organizations across the state of Arizona. I found 48 different definitions, meanings, and associations to the term local. I also looked at how they defined it, and I created with Anderson Moyer a ArcGIS map of all of the different definitions so that you could virtually look at it. I had it all in a very big Excel spreadsheet, and it was just not fun to look at. And I want my thesis to be something that you would want to look at and read. I then categorized every definition based on Erickson's taxonomy. There's 3 major taxonomies. I then broke into a larger subset of subcategories based on the Arizona influencers that I looked at. Additionally, I compared the quantitative results with the qualitative. So when it comes to this data set, I just want to show you all this dashboard, and it'll be available for everyone to use. I really want to thank Anderson for all of his support and help in doing this for me. For example, here, if we wanted to see what organizations defined local as fresh produce, we have 26. And so these blue dots represents the geographical location across the state of Arizona. When we look across all organizations, I actually had national organizations like grocery stores, like Whole Foods, and a couple farm to table online sale companies, and this kind of is a representation of it. Once again, you can actually choose multiple definitions. So for example, here we have several organizations. We have 5 that actually define local food as fresh produce and something to do with the growing practices. So local food has something to do with this food. And as you can see on the right, it defines what groups are actually talking about it. When it comes to the actual definition itself, I have a description that kind of tells you what I found was the terminology. What was the definition? If you were to say, this is what the group said, this is what I felt that they meant. We also then have the taxonomy within Erickson's that I broke it into, and then you see the subcategory that I created. So once again, I'd like to thank Anderson for that. So when it comes to our definitions, we have 1 to 12 definitions used by a group. One group used 12, several groups, 18, only used 1 definition. You do see that there is kind of a drop off after 7. And so I would postulate that maybe 1 definition to 7 definitions is kind of a good number of definitions, I guess, to ascribe to local food. When it comes to the top definitions, we see that the state of Arizona highly does well, and that's because it's a state. Our country is based on politics. Our country is based on state structures, and food organizations and government structures heavily rely on state universities and state agencies. That's just kind of a disclaimer. We also see that direct connection to our producer is a very high performing definition. Unfortunately, this is where it gets confusing. Regional or region does really well. But when you look at region, it actually has close to 20 definitions for itself. It goes ranging from Southern Arizona, which did really well, all the way to the Four Corners area, or East Valley, Phoenix had one. So regional is not something that I reviewed, but it is something that is directly connected to local. When you look at a lot of policies, they say local and regional food systems. So this is a conversation that needs to be had, because oftentimes local is seen as embedded within a larger regional or region framework. But once again, this word region can really be flexible from Flagstaff area all the way to half of the state of Arizona. When it comes to the breakdown, the subcategorization that I did of geographical areas, we looked at physical distance. It did not perform well. The 150-mile cutoff was actually used by a mega farmers market that had, I think it was 10 different entities. And so that physical distance only performed well because of one entity. When you look at the political geographic reference, we see that the state of Arizona does quite well. The city of Arizona, or cities of Arizona, do quite well as counties and tribal governments. That is awesome in that we have these kind of different structures and these different embeddedness within our political structures that we can kind of evaluate. They give us a, typically they're built on size. Based on the previous chapter's work, you could see how city with the FAB zones could be more than a county. So sometimes a county could be bigger, sometimes a county can be smaller than a city. When it comes to the values, this really big question mark when it comes to attributing local food, we see product-based come out, which is the food itself. What does the food itself represent? What does it do? And so we have homegrown and family-owned as a big one down at the bottom. And then we have a smaller medium grower, which was the best producing product-based. We then have a human-based, where it's more specific to the person and what they do, or is it helping people? Specifically in that the local economy was a big one that produced well as there was a couple people that talked about they wanted there to be a farmer's market feel when it came to the local food buying. When it comes to another value, there's standards. This is a very interesting one that I find both needing to be researched, but also we need to have conversations about, is this appropriate? We have these kind of categorizations of standards, these seals, these certifications. We have organic. Food assistance program is when I talk about SNAP, EBT, food stamps, things of that nature. Some producers or some of these groups I looked at required there to be this government program in place. Also, the state of Arizona has this Arizona Grown label. This is common across all states. Every state pretty much has its own grow local group. We also see that values are actually kind of miscellaneous. We see that some groups just use the word local. Other groups actually wanted a % local. For example, if you were to make salsa, they wanted you to have at least 40% of the products local to Arizona. Additionally, when we look at another categorization, we have the relational aspect. So are we directly talking and interacting with our food producer, or are we having an intermediary? Do we have a second party, another person that is handling the food? And we see that one of the best producing across the board is this direct connection. And this is something that is both good, but also bad, because you have to validate that you're actually the person buying it. Where I lived in Ohio, oftentimes people would go to Amish country, they would buy it for cheaper, and then they'd come back and sell it and say it was theirs. And so there needs to be some kind of approval for, is it directly from that? Interestingly enough, on that topic, a group in Phoenix, a farmer's market, required an affidavit, and I think they even said that you had to, if you bought something, you had to sell it within 2 days for it to be considered local and for you to sell at a farmer's market. My next big thing, and this is kind of the culmination of the thesis, this is chapter 4. I brought the two methods together. As you can see on the right, pink is the rural areas of Arizona. Yellow is the Tucson area, and Phoenix is the green area. These are the FAV zones. And then I have every county outlined. I want to thank once again Anderson for his help with this. You can see every group is depicted, so you can kind of see that density of population matters for the groups. Phoenix has the most, or FAV zone, the Phoenix FAV zone, then followed by Tucson, and then rural Arizona. But if you look at rural Arizona, we have a high percentage in Mojave County and a pretty high percentage in Coconino, but there's none in La Paz or Graham. Now, my searches were based on Google searches and Bing searches and documents I found available online. So there might be groups I didn't see or find, and I know that this is not the most exhaustive, but it is as good as my time could permit. Also, something to be a note is that political boundaries were common across both methods. So political boundary is interesting because there's data there. There's a lot of different groups that collect information, obviously, because we're in a political structured world. Oddly enough, the physical distance, the resiliency, and the urban to rural are not common. And those were the things that we used heavily in my quantitative methods. Those are the things that we could measure. But a lot of the qualitative groups didn't really talk about those specific metrics. They actually talked more on the values and on that relational. Something I didn't study that should be studied is the direct to consumer or direct to market sales. There's data there where you could actually track, kind of maybe based on place, how well are people actually directly selling to consumers. One of the last things I looked at was the urban to ruralness based on the groups. So you can see once again that our biggest producing areas for people, where we have a lot of people, we have the most groups. Red is in the middle, purple once again is very rural, and the blue area is very urban. We have a lot, once again, of the small metro, micropolitan, and the non-core. As you can see, we only have one county for each of the top 3 urban areas. That is good, though, because other states, for example, South Dakota, is a complete one. Their whole area is a FAV zone, and they don't have a ton of urban to rural discrepancy. Some of my big recommendations, I identified 6 stakeholders that I'd like to say would be instrumental in helping local food. I tailored some of these recommendations based on the individual, but I also did some universal ones. So, for example, clearly define what local means to you, your group, or your organization. That is a universal recommendation I give. I also recommend that if you're a consumer, that you align your purchasing power with the definition that you ascribe to as local. I also recommend that if you're a government, you help build policies across the food supply chain. I recommend with advocates that you unite others around a shared meaning. You are a critical voice in these developments. If you're a researcher or an academic, you need to analyze these definitions and make sure that they're accurately attributed to local. Is someone lying? Is someone greenwashing a label? Is someone paying a price they shouldn't? Is someone saying that they're helping the earth and they're not? Additionally, if you're a business, you need to have strategic, innovative solutions at different supply chain nodes, at different choke points of local food, because we find that food only exists within a certain network. Also, if you're a food producer, you need to find validation in the certifications of your definition. You need to be able to show that you're actually doing what you're doing. This is a figure I made. I need to do some editing because I thought of some new ones when I was preparing for this, and this will be available for people in my thesis. Additionally, I want to talk about the different subcategories. Within geographical, there's 4. Within relational, there's 2. And within values, there's 4. So I subcategorized every definition, hoping to provide kind of a scientific taxonomy structure to definitions. Additionally, I want to talk about these frameworks. Local food is not isolated. It exists within a structure, within a society, within a framework. And so you really can't manage anything until you know the background and the context. And so the social embeddedness, it really is important that you do the outer circles before you move inward. You cannot have a metric to measure unless you have a metric itself. And you cannot have a metric unless you have a meaning that the metric is based on. Additionally, when you look at an engineering framework, you must go from bottom to top. We always idealize and want to manage local food, but we don't know what we're managing. And it's really important to have that foundational framework and knowledge of shared meaning and shared definition. Lastly, my final thoughts, local food only exists across a co-location of the supply chain. So we need both farms, and consumers. We need both manufacturing and packaging. We need distribution and storage. And it does not exist unless these all happen. And it's really important to look at the manufacturing of food, because oftentimes these manufactured foods travel the farthest and are not included in local food. But here in Flagstaff, I've worked with a tortilla company, a hot sauce company, a vegan plant alternative whole food company, and those are just as local because they source local ingredients. Additionally, balance must be struck and trade-offs must be made. It is unfortunate, but we cannot have everything. We need to have the right distance, but the right price. We need to have the right distance and the right amount of local. We need to have the right amount of diversity and the right amount of local, and we need the right amount of distance and the right amount of resiliency. So my last and biggest recommendation that I kind of have thought about recently is that we need to look at counties as a viable option to define local. And this is specifically because of we're in a colonized framework of the United States where counties are there. We have county governments, we have county data, we have US government data that goes all the way down to the county. We can actually viably look at all these different data points that actually have a defined metric and a defined area. And additionally, if we decide that county is the way to go, we need to have elastic definitions for bigger and smaller. For example, where I live in Coconino County, it is the second largest in the country. It is bigger than 7 states back east. It is bigger than several states together. And that is a county. And so we need to understand that that needs to be elastic, but also know that if you live in Hawaii, where you might have one of the smallest counties, you also need to have maybe a bigger framework for what is local. Additionally, if we do create boundaries around county, there needs to be buffer zones. For example, in Western Arizona, we have Bullhead City and we have Lake Havasu. These are communities that are bordering the Colorado River that divides California, Nevada, and Arizona. And so we need to allow for these transition zones. Oftentimes people drive to a urban area that is across county lines. So we need to see these buffer zones and see that county might be best, but maybe multi-county, or maybe we create this fab zone that's a little more intricate or maybe a little more defined. And so with that, I would like to open this with questions. I know I went over a little bit, so thank you everyone for your time and support. I open it now to everyone. I'm going to unshare my screen, but if anyone wants me to go back to a specific slide, I can actually do that, and we can talk questions there.